Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, and thank you for joining us today. And we have this little break in the rain, so we're very excited. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and I'd like to thank them for the support of this event and for the lunch they provided today. For today's program, we're going to hear from PPI researcher Dean Bonner, who will present the findings from PPIC's latest statewide survey on Californians and their government. You should have received a handout at registration which contains highlights from the survey. The full survey report, along with the slides from today's presentation, are now available online at ppic.org. We'd very much like to thank the James Irvine Foundation, the California Endowment, and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this particular survey. After Dean's presentation, we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A. And a few more things before we get started. Later today, you'll receive a survey. Please fill those out. We do look at those, and they do help us design our presentations in a way that will be more enjoyable for you. And please turn off your cell phones. You know, today, for many of you, you've been experiencing a lot of rain. I actually have lived in Sacramento for about 30 years. I remember when March Miracle came. And that was when we hadn't had rain all winter. And then we actually had this one huge storm for about a month. This year's storms may be March Madness in a way that we may not want. Had to throw that in because my bracket isn't doing really well. I now want to invite Dean up to the podium. He's PPIC Associate Surveys Director. Dean's bracket's doing better than mine, and he will present today's findings.
Thank you. I will say if my bracket is doing better than hers, that's surprising because I kind of stopped looking at it after Saturday, so I may have to loop back in then. So today we'll be looking at another Californians and their government. Oops, sorry about that. All right. Oops. One moment. There we go. So today we'll be looking at another Californians in their government survey. I was here in January looking at some of these issues as well, but before we do that, let's start off by looking at the mission of the PPIC Statewide Survey. Our mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. Our goal is to inform and improve state policy making, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. We look to provide a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates, and in doing so, we've talked to over 330,000 Californians since 1998 in over 160 surveys that cover either issue-specific, regional, or general topic surveys. The Californians and Their Government series is funded by the James Irvine Foundation. And this particular survey, we looked at federal issues as well as state issues. In the federal section, we looked at approval ratings of elected officials as well as trust in government. We also looked at immigration policy, terrorism, and government regulation. In the state section, once again, we looked at approval ratings of elected officials and California's overall mood towards the state, as well as the state and local tax system, water policy, and views on the high-speed rail system. Interviews were conducted earlier this month from March 5th to 14th. In a change from January, we are now up to 65% cell phone interviews and 35% landline. This is to make sure that we are getting the most representative sample for our surveys. And we interviewed just over 1,700 Californians and those have a margin of error of 3.3%, and we have just over 1,000 likely voters, and that margin of error is 4.2%. So let's begin by looking at the approval of federal elected officials. About 1 in 3 Californians approve of the president and approve of Congress, while about half approve of their own representative. This idea that they are more approving of their own representative than Congress overall is consistent with what we found in the past as well. Approval of President Trump is much higher among Republicans than others, and outside of conservatives, they're the only group where approval is higher than 50%. Men are 15 points more likely than women to approve of President Trump, and this is an increase from January when the gap was 10 points. Californians are less likely than Americans nationwide, according to January Gallup survey, to approve of the president. Regarding Congress, approval is lower across parties and fewer than half across regions and demographic groups approve. And Californians are somewhat more likely than adults nationwide to approve of Congress. Regarding their own representative, we find that pluralities across regions and demographic groups approve of their own House representative, although as you can see, there are some differences across party that are evident. So turning to California's U.S. senators, just under half of Californians approve of Senator Dianne Feinstein and newly elected Senator Kamala Harris. Partisan divisions are similar for both senators, and both enjoy their highest approval in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's notable and expected that Senator Dianne Feinstein's approval rating in the Bay Area is about 11 points higher than that of Kamala Harris. And both enjoy higher approval among the more educated Californians. Since we first asked Californians' opinion of Senator Feinstein, her approval has ranged from the mid-40s to the mid-50s, so pretty consistent. And in recent years, it's hovered right around half. And this is our first reading of approval on Kamala Harris, but look for that in the coming months. We'll look to see how she's doing later in the year. Turning to immigration policy, and specifically what should happen to undocumented immigrants currently living in the U.S., we find that a strong majority of Californians think that they should be allowed to stay in the country and eventually apply for citizenship. Another 12% think they should be able to stay but not apply for citizenship, and 15% say that they should be required to leave. Partisans are divided on this issue, although it is worth pointing out that a majority of Republicans think that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay in the U.S. Among racial ethnic groups, we find that Latinos and African Americans are the most likely to think that they should be allowed to stay and apply for citizenship. And there's widespread agreement that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay and apply for citizenship, with majorities across all age, education, and income groups holding this view, as well as more than 6 in 10 across regions. I should point out that results today are similar to prior questions that we have asked, where it only presented 2 options, either allowed to stay or required to leave. And in those surveys, we found that more than 8 in 10 said that undocumented immigrants here in the U.S. should be allowed to stay. Findings among adults nationwide were similar, according to a February CBS News survey. So Californians are slightly more likely to say that they should be allowed to stay and apply for citizenship, but there isn't a great difference there. And as plans for President Trump's border wall begin in earnest with his budget blueprint, Californians' opinions of the wall have not really changed. Today, 1 in 4 Californians are in favor, and 7 in 10 are opposed. Partisans continue to be divided, and these differences have only increased since we first asked this question last May. Opposition among Democrats has increased 6 points, while opposition among Republicans has actually declined 9 points. So that's notable. We find that solid majorities across racial ethnic groups, regions, and demographic groups oppose building the wall, and not surprisingly, opposition is highest among Latinos, and it also declines with age. Adults nationwide were about 10 points more likely to favor building the wall in a February Pew Research Center poll. So Californians somewhat different there. So we also wanted to ask some questions about terrorism and homeland security, given the attention it has been paid in recent months. And today we find that about 1 in 4 Californians perceive terrorism and homeland security as a big problem in California. And outside of January 2016, fewer than 1 in 3 have viewed this as a big problem, dating back to surveys in 2001. We did see a spike in January 2016 in the wake of the terrorist attack in San Bernardino in December 2015, when 43% viewed terrorism and security as a big problem in California. As I said, dating back to periodic surveys to 2001, about 1 in 4 have consistently held this view. Republicans are much more likely than independents and Democrats to hold this view, and across regions, Inland Empire residents are the most likely to call terrorism a big problem, while those in the San Francisco Bay Area are the least likely. Perceptions of terrorism as a big problem decreases with rising education and income as well. So when it comes to the role that the government, or the manner in which the government is doing it in reducing the threat of terrorism, we find that nearly 6 in 10 Californians say that the government is doing very or fairly well. And while majorities across parties say the government is doing well, Republicans are more likely than Democrats and independents to hold this view. This is a wildly held belief, with more than half across regions and demographic groups saying that government is doing well. In a separate question, we asked specifically about the government's anti-terrorism policies, and we found that about half of Californians think that these policies have gone too far in restricting the average person's civil liberties, while about 4 in 10 say that they have not gone far enough. So, as timely as it was, President Trump introduced his revised travel ban after we had been in the field a single night. So we decided to add a question specifically asking about his revised travel plan. We also asked a question about his handling of terrorism and homeland security more generally. And what we find is that in both cases, just shy of 4 in 10 Californians approve of his handling of terrorism and approve of his revised travel ban. It's quite interesting to note that approval on terrorism and approval of his revised ban are quite similar, even across the groups beyond just party. Fewer than half across regions and demographic groups approve of his handling of terrorism or his revised travel ban. So it's pretty, pretty consistent in the way that people view both of these issues. So with President Trump's focus on reducing regulation, government regulation, and in particular those regulations dealing with environmental laws, we wanted to kind of come back to some questions that we've asked in the past. And what we find is that over half of Californians think that government regulation of business is necessary to protect the public interest, while just fewer than 4 in 10 say that these regulations do more harm than good. When it comes to specific environmental laws and regulations, just over half think that these laws and regulations are worth the cost, while about 4 in 10 say that they cost too many jobs and hurt the economy. So in both of these cases, just over half feel positively about the impact of regulations. There are partisan divisions, of course, on both of these, with Democrats more than twice as likely to view these as necessary and worth the cost. And pluralities across regions and demographic groups hold this view that they're worth the cost and are necessary. And this is consistent with findings that we've had in periodic surveys where just over half say that they're worth the cost, and about 4 in 10 say that they're cost too many jobs or not worth the cost. So we were asking about political trust this month, so we also wanted to kind of ask specifically about the trustworthiness of President Trump. And when asked about this, Californians offer an assessment which is highly partisan and very similar to his overall approval. So 3 in 10 say that he is trustworthy. Large majorities in either parties hold these opposing views. And in addition to the evident partisan differences, there are stark differences across racial ethnic groups, with white respondents being more than twice as likely as African Americans and Latinos to view President Trump as trustworthy. There's widespread agreement that President Trump is untrustworthy, with more than half across regions and demographic groups holding this view. So when we look at kind of a more general view of trust in government, we find that relatively few Californians say that they can trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time, while 7 in 10 say that they can trust government to do what is right only some or none of the time. More than 2 in 3 across parties express distrust in government, but it's worth noting that the Republican distrust in government is much higher than their distrust of President Trump in particular. More than 6 in 10 across regions, age, education, and income groups say that the federal government can only be trusted some or none of the time. And these findings have been quite steady, with fewer than half saying that they trust the government to do what is right just about always and most of the time in periodic surveys dating back to 1998. And so views on trust have, this isn't necessarily a new thing that Californians are distrustful of the federal government. Looking specifically at the idea of the control of special interest, we've asked a battery of 3 trust questions in periodic surveys, and this is one that deals specifically with special interest. And we find that 7 in 10 Californians, including more than 2 in 3 across parties, say the federal government is pretty much run by a few big interests looking out for themselves rather than run for the benefit of all the people. And about 2 in 3 or more have held this view since 2010. So once again, this is a steady finding. And as I mentioned, there's bipartisan agreement. And there's also the fact that as educational attainment and income increase, this trustworthiness increases, this distrusting aspect increases as well. In the third question of our trust battery, we also ask about waste in federal government. And we find that 6 in 10 say that the federal government wastes a lot of taxpayer money, with another 1 in 4 saying that they waste some. And I should note that the last time we asked this question was in October, just prior to the election. And similar to findings that we saw in January regarding the optimism about the country, we also find here regarding trust, where Democrats' trust in government has actually declined since October, and we've seen an increase among Republican trust in government on all 3 questions. And so that's something that we can kind of track back over time, the way the Democrats felt under President Bush and Republicans felt under Bill Clinton. And so this is something that we see, this kind of ebb and flow, while at the same time, on most of these trust questions, there hasn't been a big difference in the kind of overall top line number regarding trust, but the kind of who's trusting has kind of gone back and forth. So turning to the state section, we find that about 6 in 10 Californians approve of Governor Brown. This is pretty much similar to a record high 62% that we found in January. And it's remarkable that basically since April 2014, which accounts to about 21 consecutive surveys, the governor has enjoyed majority approval. Before that, the kind of pattern that we saw is that there was this higher share of people not sure of how to rate him. And so since then, when he's kind of, when the share of people that were unsure decreased, we actually seen this increase in kind of baseline approval. And, since 2014, we've seen this steady share of people saying they approve. So about 2 in 3 Republicans disapprove of Governor Brown, while a majority of Democrats and half of independents approve. Majorities across regions and demographic groups approve of the governor. Regarding the legislature, we find about half of people approve of their job today. And this is quite interesting because about half approve today, and this marks the first time since January 2001 that we found back-to-back surveys where majority approval of the legislature. So in general, it's been below 50%, but we have seen an increase, and it seemed to mostly hold after January. In total, we find that 44% of Californians approve of both the governor and the legislature, while about 1 in 5 disapprove of both. And so that's pretty interesting finding in that, almost half say that they can approve of both of the governor and the legislature. When we look at the state legislators representing Senate and Assembly districts, we find that just over half approve, with 2 in 3 Democrats approving compared to 1 in 4 Republicans approving of their own state legislator. So when we look at the overall mood of the state, more than half of Californians say that the state is heading in the right direction and expect good economic times. At least 4 in 10 Californians have said that the state is heading in the right direction and expect good economic times since December 2012. We find that pluralities of Democrats have positive perceptions on both of these dimensions, while Republicans are pessimistic about the direction of state. They're more positive about the expectation of good economic times. However, prior to last month, when we found just shy of half saying that they have positive perceptions, fewer than 4 in 10 Republicans had been optimistic about either of these overall mood questions since January 2008. So seemingly, we've seen an increase in this perception among Republicans that we can expect good economic times. And that's kind of tied, it appears, to kind of overall findings regarding the economy at the national level that we saw in January after the election after the inauguration of Donald Trump. Optimism about the direction of the state is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area, while optimism about the economic outlook of the state is highest in the Central Valley and Orange San Diego County. So there's a little bit of differentiation there. So with tax day quickly approaching, as someone who hasn't quite done their taxes yet is quite remembering that, just over half of Californians say that the state and local tax system is fair, and at least half of Californians have held that view each year since 2014. 6 in 10 Democrats and half of independents say that the tax system is fair, while 6 in 10 Republicans say it is not fair. Majorities across income groups say the system is fair, as do at least half across regions, age, education, and racial ethnic groups. It's notable that those who approve of their state elected officials are far more likely than those who disapprove, to say that the state and local tax system is fair. While just over half of Californians view the state and local tax system as fair, nearly 6 in 10 say that they think they pay more than they should. Another 35% say they pay the right amount. The belief that more is paid in taxes than should be increases with income and is much higher among Republicans than other partisans. Majorities across age, education, and racial ethnic groups believe that they pay more than they should. And once again, there are wide differences between those who approve and disapprove of their elected officials. In a separate question, we wanted to gauge Californians' opinions about the need for change in the state and local tax system. And we found that 8 in 10 Californians think that change is needed, with 42% calling for major changes. Interestingly, Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats to say that major changes are needed in the system. So that's important to keep it in mind as we look for possible tax reform. So turning to water policy, and in particular infrastructure, we wanted to gauge support among Californians for both kind of the idea of more general spending on water and flood management infrastructure, as well as support for building tunnels in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. We find that by a 10-point margin, Californians are more likely to view spending in general as very important compared to building the Delta tunnels. There are stark regional differences that emerge in regards to the comparative importance of each. As you can see, those in the Central Valley are 25 points more likely to call spending on water infrastructure, water and flood management infrastructure is very important compared to building the tunnels. And when it comes to spending more money in their part of California, majorities across parties and demographic groups view this as very important. Now, when it comes to the importance of the actual Delta tunnels, while just 4 in 10 overall in the Central Valley view this as very important, there are big differences within the valley, with residents in the San Joaquin Valley more likely than those in the Sacramento metro area and North Valley to view the Delta tunnels as very important. And Governor Brown's role in the Delta tunnels appears evident because while spending on the overall general infrastructure question are viewed similar among those who approve and disapprove of Governor Brown, there are large differences when it comes to the Delta tunnel among those who approve and disapprove. So each March for the last few years, we've asked about the high-speed rail system, so we wanted to continue that this year. And nearly 2 in 3 Californians view the high-speed rail system as very important today. Solid majorities of Democrats and independents call the system very important compared to fewer than 4 in 10 Republicans. Residents in Los Angeles are the most likely, while residents in the Central Valley are the least likely to call the high-speed rail system very important to the economic quality and vitality of California. And importance declines as age and income increases, and it's lower among whites and other racial ethnic groups. When we look at support for the high-speed rail system, while 2 in 3 call the high-speed rail system important, Californians are closely divided when it comes to the building of the system. Following a similar pattern to the importance of the system, support is highest in the Los Angeles area and lowest in the Central Valley. Democrats, as you can see, are far more likely than Republicans to support the high-speed rail system. Once again, support declines as age increases, while there's roughly similar across education and income groups. Given the governor's support for the project, it's not surprising that those who approve of the governor are 3 times more likely than those who disapprove to favor this plan. In a follow-up, we asked people if they would favor or oppose the high-speed rail system if it cost less. And in total, 66% of Californians said that they would favor, if you include the people who said they would favor if it costs less. So we also wanted to touch upon the subject of crime, race relations, and the police. And we find that 1 in 4 Californians view violence and street crime in their local community as a big problem. Another 35% call it somewhat of a problem, and the plurality of 39% say it is not much of a problem. Residents in the San Francisco Bay Area and Orange San Diego are the least likely to view it as a problem. College graduates and those with household incomes greater than $80,000 are much less likely than others to view crime as a big problem. And so there are some differences when you come to the kind of socioeconomic factors that you might expect. So when it comes to their local police, 2 in 3 Californians say that their local police are doing an excellent or good job in controlling crime in their community. African Americans are far less likely than others to rate their police as excellent or good, and notably, they are 3 times more likely to rate them as poor. While San Francisco Bay Area residents are among the least likely to call crime a big problem, they're also the least likely across regions to say that their police are doing an excellent or good job. And we find that while more than 6 in 10 across parties say their local police are doing a good job, it is much higher among Republicans than among other groups. So what we've seen in recent years when it comes to kind of the conversation about the job that police are doing is this conversation about the role that race plays within the criminal justice system. And we find that the share of Californians who say that minorities do not receive equal treatment in the criminal justice system has increased each year since we began asking this question in 2015. And today, 2 in 3 say that they do not receive equal treatment. And while solid majorities across racial ethnic groups say minorities do not receive equal treatment, African Americans are by far the most likely to hold this view. As you might expect, there's a large partisan divide on this issue, with nearly all Democrats saying that minorities do not receive equal treatment, while 56% of Republicans say that they do receive equal treatment. To put that number in context, fewer than 4 in 10 across regions and demographic groups say that minorities receive equal treatment. So Republicans are a big outlier on this question. So in conclusion, similar to January, we find that about 1 in 3 Californians approve of President Trump, slightly more approve of his approach to terrorism and his revised travel ban. Just under half of Californians approve of Senators Feinstein and Harris. Most Californians, as they have in the past, believe that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay, and most also oppose building a border wall. 6 in 10 Californians view state spending on water and flood management infrastructure is very important, while half view building the Delta tunnels is very important. And most Californians give excellent or good ratings to the local police, but a growing majority believe that there are racial disparities within the criminal justice system. So at this point, I'll open it up for questions. I will ask that if you have a question to wait for someone with a mic to come to you so that we can make sure we're capturing it on audio and video. Yes. Yes.
I'm astounded by these partisan differences. I don't think trains used to be a party political issue. Have you compared these partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats with results of earlier surveys? And are they greater in this survey? Thinking of particular, perhaps not, criminal justice or something which one would expect to be a political issue, but something like infrastructure, which in the past is not particularly party political.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that I can't speak specifically to the idea of the train, but we have seen a heightening in the partisanship, and I think you see that at the national level and at the state level, especially when it comes, as I mentioned, kind of the views of those who approve of Governor Brown versus disapprove of Governor Brown. You kind of see that on the issue of say, high-speed rail or the Delta tunnels, that tends to kind of exacerbate the partisanship. So it's something that we definitely monitor, and it's quite interesting in this time that of hyper-partisanship, it appears, as you say, even on issues that perhaps may not have been partisan in the past.
Yeah, do you have all these data by the regions you identified, and would you say our hyper-partisanship is also geographic in California?
On many issues, there is a regional divide where you see kind of the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles being more liberal when it comes to policies. However, I will say that when you look at Orange San Diego, which is often viewed as a pretty conservative area, there are a lot of areas or there are policies where they tend to align with the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles. And I forgot to mention earlier that I would encourage you online, we put our crosstabs among all adults and likely voters with a multitude of breakouts regarding region, age, education, income, racial, ethnic groups. And so beyond me answering your questions today, if you have some curiosity, you can also look there. Yes. Yeah.
Nationally, it's observed to be coastal versus inland. Is that also true here? And particularly Central Valley, I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think that on many issues, you'll find that kind of the coastal versus inland, specifically if you look at, say, San Francisco Bay Area versus Inland Empire or Central Valley, there are some differences there as well. Yeah, so.
Somewhat a follow-up on the geography part. Thinking flood protection, if you're on higher ground, you probably don't worry about it as much as if you're in Yuba City or somewhere at certain times. Water, everyone's looking for good, reliable water, so it's kind of everywhere. Conveyance, though, may be only to those who are familiar where their water comes, if you're in Southern California from the Colorado or from the Delta. And the train is kind of important if you're near a train station, but on the rail system, if you're not. I'm curious how, if at all, you differentiate geographically coming back, because I could see someone in the Bay Area could respond on the rail because they think it sounds like a cool idea, but they're nowhere near related to those where the impacts are. And others could be said the same on water.
Yeah, that's something I haven't specifically looked at given our survey schedule. We kind of, have a busy time before we release the survey, but that's interesting. I do think that there probably is something to say about kind of where the train is and whether or not you'd be a benefactor of that train when it comes to your approval of the system. But that's something I haven't directly looked at. Yeah. Yes.
With respect to attitudes toward taxation in California, did you drill down further to the type of taxation? Because one might expect different attitudes towards sales tax compared with income tax or real estate tax.
Yeah, that's not something we asked about in this survey, but in previous surveys, we know that items where we're taxing, where the state's taxing, say, other people, whether that be higher income earners or people who smoke or people who are involved in, say, sin taxes, that there are higher approval for those than, say, an increase in the overall state sales tax. But
Everett Dirksen talked about the fellow behind the tree.
yeah, and so that's something that we periodically come back to. And so I would say just be on the lookout because it's something that we definitely ask a few times a year normally. Yeah. One more? Yes.
This is more on process. I'd just be interested, do you tend to call the same people each time, or how do you select something random? How do you know in advance which are going to be mobile phones versus landlines? I mean, can you tell us kind of the story behind the curtain, if you will?
Yeah, so our surveys are conducted on landline and cell phone. As I said, we just recently bumped up to 65% cell phone. This is something that we've tried to keep up with regarding kind of the number of people who have only cell phones. And I think that, what was the second part of your question, or the first part, I should say?
Oh, the selection of the who you call, and do you
Yes.
ever do a reach back to some of the same
Yeah.
people to see if their ideals have changed?
So our surveys are each independent when it comes to the random digit dialing protocol that we use, that basically all landline exchanges in California as well as cell phone exchanges are available to be called, and it's done totally at random. We don't have a panel at this current time where we would be calling people back to kind of go back and ask further questions on specific topics. Yes.
Along those same lines, Along those same lines, do you offer your questions in Spanish or any other languages?
Yes. So our survey is conducted in Spanish and English, as according to the preference of the respondent. And so that's very important in a state like California. It's becoming increasingly important even in national polling, but in a state like California, where about a third of the state's adults are Latino, that's definitely important. Yes. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up and chat.